This morning, we come again to the study of the Word of God, and we are in Revelation chapter 17. We continue our study of the false religious system that will one day dominate the world. We are studying Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots. This is the second part in this series. Before I read the text and we examine it, I wish to remind you of some very important truths that I believe are especially important in these days of mounting apostasy in our country and indeed in our world. In the opening paragraph of his book, Christless Christianity, Michael Horton reminded me of a sermon that I heard a number of years ago. And here's what Horton had to say, quote, "What would things look like if Satan really took control of a city?" Over a half a century ago, Presbyterian minister Donald Gray Barnhouse offered his own scenario in his weekly sermon that was also broadcast nationwide on CBS radio. Barnhouse speculated that if Satan took over Philadelphia, all of the bars would be closed, pornography banished, and pristine streets would be filled with tidy pedestrians who smiled at each other. There would be no swearing. The children would say, "Yes, sir," and "No, ma'am," and the churches would be full every Sunday where Christ is not preached. End quote. Dear friends, the vast majority of evangelical churches are meeting together today around this country and frankly in other places around the world, and they will hear a message where Christ is not preached. After all, today's sermons must be relevant. They must be entertaining, certainly non-offensive. They must focus on things like our great enemy, liberalism, or some moral crusade like abortion or homosexuality or whatever. The focus will be primarily on our needs, our desires, our purpose in life, our self-esteem, our experience, our psychological health. The pastor will sound more like Dr. Phil than the Apostle Paul. He will sound more like a late-night comedian than the man of sorrows acquainted with grief. Today, if Christ is mentioned at all in many churches, he will typically be portrayed more as a personal trainer to help us be all that we can be, rather than the Son of God who came to die as a substitute for our sin. You see, the new gospel is all about what we need to do for God in order for us to be happy, not what he has done for us so that we can be holy. So, people are asked to make decisions, to ask Jesus into their heart, to submit to certain rules. People either use the stick or the carrot. Some churches will choose the stick of endless rules that must be obeyed in order to find favor with God, while others prefer the carrot of discovering certain spiritual principles that will guarantee a successful life, both of which are equally enemies of grace. It should be no surprise that although 80% of America calls itself Christian, Christianity is having virtually no impact on our culture. The church has largely become irrelevant. Most of what we hear in pulpits is as shallow as water on a plate. Christians are theologically illiterate these days. Sermons are both trite and in many cases, as you can tell on television, downright stupid. Horton says, and I quote, "It is not heresy as much as silliness that is killing us softly. God is not denied, but trivialized, used for our life programs rather than received, worshiped, and enjoyed." End quote. One of George Barna's conclusions in his research about American spirituality says this, quote, "To increasing millions of Americans, God, if we even believe in a supernatural deity, exists for the pleasure of humankind. He resides in the heavenly realm solely for our utility and benefit. Although we are too clever to voice it, we live by the notion that true power is accessed not by looking upward, but by turning inward." End quote. Now, theologically, much of this is rooted in old Pelagianism. You may recall Pelagius was a 4th century heretic that denied original sin, that believed that man was basically good and that he, by obeying the law, could save himself. And today we have in evangelicalism kind of a new brand of that, which many theologians call semi-Pelagianism, where they would say that not so much is man basically good, but man is just sick, whereas the Bible tells us that he is dead. And since man is sick, many people see that salvation is basically a synergism between God and man, a process made available by God, but ultimately initiated by man's free will and consummated by man's decision to accept Jesus into his heart. And so, dear friends, subtly what has happened over the years is man begins to move up on the stage with God and share it with him. And God gradually is diminished, and man is gradually elevated. So conversion to many today is basically this collaborative effort between man and God, where we can have a personal relationship with Christ, which is ultimately translated into a concept of being self-fulfilled. As a result, a variety of additional distortions have arisen out of all of this over the years, but they all share a common bond. And beloved, that bond is basically this. Today, Christians fail to see God as the transcendent, holy, merciful God who has condescended to save helpless sinners who are utterly unable to save themselves. But rather they see God as this invisible friend that is willing to help us find our potential in life if we just learn the secrets of how to enlist his help. For many Christians today, sin is merely making mistakes. It's merely doing stupid things that prevent us from living up to our potential and finding our purpose in life. Things that rob us of our happiness. A condition is not an understood concept here, that sin is a condition. People don't see that. They don't see that sin is that which has rendered us guilty before a holy God. That we are, as we read this morning, children of wrath, dead in our trespasses and sins, spiritually blind, the Bible tells us, deaf, deceived, utterly incapable of even responding to the gospel apart from the regenerating power of the Spirit of God. And therefore, we are in desperate need of mercy and a salvation that we cannot secure on our own. But beloved, I would submit to you that unless people understand these essential truths of the gospel will never be as exceedingly glorious as it is. The truth of the gospel will never be understood as something that is absolutely mind-boggling, that is utterly ineffable,